What I'm going to talk about today is really state violence and anti-blackness and the question of religious freedom for Candomblé practitioners, specifically in the city of Salvador in the state of Bahia. So Salvador, it's on the northeastern coast of Brazil, very far north of Rio, which more people are familiar with. Brazil is a huge country, very regionally diverse. And I want to draw attention to what the Black movement has named as the genocide against Black people in Brazil. So there are statistics that suggest that every 23 minutes, a Black person is killed in Brazil. And despite having a smaller national population than the United States by 119 million, in 2016, the Brazilian police force killed over 4 times more people than police in the United States. So there's a real articulation between Black Lives Matter movement in Brazil and the United States. So Candomblé, it's characterized by practitioners as a religion of African descent or a religion of the African matrix. And it particularly comes from regions of West and Central Africa, from people who were involved in the transatlantic slave trade from the 16th to 19th centuries. And so it's a really important context to understand that Brazil is the country that received the greatest number of African captives during the transatlantic slave trade, approximately 40% of the 10 to 12 million people who were traded from Africa to the Americas. Brazil was also the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas in 1888. This legacy marks Brazilian social, economic, cultural, and political life. So I'm focusing this short talk on religious racism. It's a term that has been used more recently as a corrective to the concept of religious intolerance. Candomblé practitioners and activists are very clear to name that the particular attacks against Candomblé are motivated by racism and anti-blackness, rather than a mere intolerance of their religious practices. So intolerance doesn't capture the violence of the hate crimes and the attacks that the temples are facing. And naming religious racism also allows for these attacks to be considered within broader social and political structures of anti-blackness, which also include environmental concerns, issues of racial and gender violence, and access to land for housing, for example. So the idea is to put religious racism in context with bigger conversations of structural racism. And if we think about how Candomblé is led by Black women specifically, we can put racial violence and gender violence into conversation. So the colonial and post-colonial states in Brazil legally persecuted Candomblé well into the 20th century. Temples had to register with a local government agency to quote unquote legally conduct ceremonies. And given the bureaucracy and the fees for doing so, most religious activities were considered illegal and subject to police raids until this requirement was lifted only in 1976. The police arrested head priestesses and priests. They seized ritual objects and destroyed and robbed the temple's property. So many of these objects are still held in government museums and archives today. Another really important factor for understanding religious racism is the rise of Pentecostalism, so evangelical Christianity, especially since the 1970s in Brazil and intensely in the last 2 decades. The evangelical position is highly antagonistic towards Candomblé. It views the orishas, the deities, as diabolic forces. So evangelicals, they're focused on conversion, and they often target Candomblé communities as places where people need to be quote unquote saved from the devil. And even though there are huge numbers of Black evangelicals in Brazil as well, the evangelical position is fueled by anti-Blackness and anti-African religious sentiments. And it's part of a longer trajectory of viewing African culture, language, and religion as quote unquote barbaric, Black magic, or satanic. Well, I want to talk about just how the rise of evangelical Christianity and specifically the relationship between evangelicals and politicians in the United States and Brazil has really increased the level of religious racism and hate crimes. So since 2014, the number of cases of religious racism that are reported to the government have increased from 149 in 2014 to 759 in 2016. And it's continued high, around 500 cases per year since. You can find more information about this at religiousracism.org. Thank you so much.